If you make a sound, they'll find you before I can save you. I didn't even recognize my own voice when I said it. Low and steady like it belonged to someone braver than me. Someone who didn't spend most nights counting down the hours until her shift ended and her coffee went cold in a paper cup labeled with the wrong name. But that night nothing felt normal. Not the flickering fluorescent lights above Bay 3. Not the way the air carried that metallic tension that had nothing to do with medicine. And definitely not the man lying on the gurney in front of me, his white shirt cut open, his breathing shallow but controlled like he was refusing to let his body betray him, like pain was just another negotiation he hadn't agreed to lose. And I remember thinking, this is not a regular patient. This is not someone who accidentally walked into the wrong place. This is someone the wrong people are already looking for. Ma'am, we need to log him in. One of the interns said behind me, his voice too loud, too unsure, and I shook my head before I even turned around. Not yet, I said, sharper than I intended, because something in my chest was already tightening. That instinct you don't learn in textbooks. The one that whispers when something is off, when a moment is about to split your life into before and after, and I stepped closer to the man. Close enough to see the faint crease between his brows, close enough to notice how even unconscious he looked, controlled, like the world bent around him instead of the other way around. Can you hear me? I whispered, even though I wasn't sure why I cared if he could, and his eyes didn't open, but his jaw shifted just slightly, just enough to tell me he wasn't as far gone as he wanted everyone to think. And that's when the doors at the end of the hallway swung open, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a kind of quiet authority that made every head turn without anyone saying a word, and I felt it before I saw them. That shift in the room, like the air itself knew something had changed, and when I glanced up, I saw two men in dark suits standing just inside the entrance, not moving, just watching, their presence too still, too deliberate, and suddenly the pieces didn't just feel wrong, they felt dangerous, like I had stepped into something I wasn't supposed to witness. And my heart started beating faster. Not panic. Not yet. Just awareness, sharp and precise. And I looked back down at the man on the gurney. Really looked this time. At the structure of his face. The calm, even in unconsciousness. The kind of calm that didn't come from safety, but from control. And something clicked in my mind. Something I couldn't fully name, but couldn't ignore either. Emily. We have to register him. The intern insisted. Closer now. Nervous. And I turned just enough to block his view. Give me a minute, I said, quieter this time, because I didn't want those men hearing more than they already had. And when I looked back down, his eyes were open, not wide, not panicked, just watching me, steady and unreadable, like he had been awake long enough to understand exactly where he was, and exactly what was at stake. And for a second, neither of us spoke, because there was too much in that silence. Too many questions neither of us could afford to ask out loud, and I leaned in, just slightly, lowering my voice so only he could hear. If you make a sound, they'll know you're here, I said, my words measured, my pulse loud in my ears, and his gaze didn't shift, didn't flicker toward the door, didn't betray anything. But I saw it then, that brief moment where he chose, where he decided whether I was a threat or something else, and I didn't know why, I didn't know what I was stepping into. But I made the choice first, stay silent. I whispered, my fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the gurney, grounding myself in something real, trust me. And for the first time since they brought him in, something in his expression changed, not fear, not relief, something quieter, something deeper, like recognition without understanding, and in that moment, with strangers watching from across the room and a man I didn't know placing his life in my hands without saying a word, I realized I had already crossed a line I couldn't step back from, and whatever happened next it had already begun. I did not look at the men by the door again, not directly, but I felt them, like a shadow that did not belong to the light, and every second they stood there made the room feel smaller, tighter, like the walls were quietly closing in on all of us, and I forced my hands to stay steady as I reached for the chart at the end of the gurney. Blank, no name, no history, just a body that should have been logged into the system 5 minutes ago. And I knew that was the first thing they would check, not his condition, not his breathing, but his identity, because men like that did not come looking for patients. They came looking for information, and information was something I could still control, at least for now. Emily, what do you want me to put down? The intern asked again, closer this time, his voice low like he finally understood that something was wrong even if he could not explain it. And I kept my eyes on the paper, not on the man beside me, not on the door, just the lines waiting to be filled. Unknown male, I said quietly, my pen hovering for a second before I pressed it down, committing to something I could not take back. Mid-30s, brought in without identification, and I heard the hesitation in the room, the unspoken question of why I was delaying what should have been routine, but no one challenged me. Not yet, because confidence, I had learned, could be just as powerful as authority if you used it at the right moment, and I moved quickly after that, adjusting the monitors, checking his pulse, doing everything I would normally do, but with a different intention, not just to treat him, but to buy time, every second stretching longer than it should, every movement deliberate, and I leaned in again, just enough so my words would not carry beyond him. They are waiting for you to speak. I whispered, my voice barely more than breath. Do not give them a reason. And his eyes stayed on mine, sharp now, fully awake, not confused, not disoriented, just watching, calculating, like he was measuring the risk of trusting a stranger who had no reason to be involved in whatever world he came from. And for a moment I thought he might push past me, might say something, might take control of the situation the way men like him probably always did. But he did not. He stayed still, silent, exactly like I asked, and that was when I realized this was not just instinct anymore. This was a decision, his and mine, and the sound of footsteps pulled my attention back toward the hallway, slow, deliberate, not rushed like hospital staff, and I saw one of the men step forward, not aggressive, not threatening, just calm in a way that felt far more dangerous, and my heart kicked harder against my ribs. But I did not step back. I did not move away from the gurney, because if I did, even for a second, I would lose whatever control I had managed to create. We are looking for someone, he said, his voice even, polite in a way that made it harder to refuse, and I met his gaze, forcing my expression into something neutral, something tired and unimpressed like every other long shift had trained me to be. You and everyone else, I replied, letting a hint of irritation slip into my tone, like this was just another interruption I did not have time for, and I gestured toward the busy room behind me. The noise, the movement, the chaos that usually felt overwhelming but now worked in my favor. We have 6 patients waiting and not enough beds, so unless you are checking in, you need to step back. And for a second, just a second, I saw it. The flicker of surprise in his eyes, because I had not hesitated, I had not asked questions, I had not given him anything to work with, and silence stretched between us, heavy and uncertain. And behind me, I felt the man on the gurney watching, not just the situation, but me, like he was trying to understand why I was doing this, why I was standing between him and something I did not even fully understand. And the man at the door finally nodded once, slow, measured, like he was deciding this was not the moment to push further. If you see anything unusual, he said, his voice softer now, almost casual, you will let us know. And I held his gaze just long enough to make it believable before I looked away, dismissing him the same way I would any other distraction. And when his footsteps faded, when the tension in the room eased just slightly, I exhaled a breath I had not realized I was holding, and only then did I look back at the man beside me, his eyes still locked on mine, steady, unreadable, and I whispered, quieter this time, almost to myself, you are still here because I said nothing. And something in his expression shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in a wall that had never been meant to break. The room did not go back to normal after they left. It only pretended to, like a held breath that had not fully been released, and I could feel it in the way the monitors seemed louder, in the way the staff moved just a little faster, but spoke just a little softer, as if everyone sensed something had passed through without understanding what it was. And I forced myself to keep moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant realizing exactly how far I had stepped out of line, and I was not ready for that yet. Not while he was still lying there watching me like I was the only variable he had not calculated. You should not have done that, he said finally, his voice low, controlled, not weak like a patient, not uncertain like someone who had just been pulled out of danger, but steady, deliberate, like every word had weight behind it. and I paused for half a second before I looked at him. Really looked this time. Because hearing him speak changed something, made this real. In a way it had not been before. You should not be here. I replied, quieter, matching his tone, because raising my voice felt like breaking something fragile between us, and his lips almost moved. Not quite a smile, not quite anything I could define, but enough to tell me he understood exactly what I meant. And for a moment we just held that silence again, not empty this time, but full of something unspoken, something that made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, and I turned back to the chart because I needed distance. Even if it was just a few inches. You are not listed in the system, I said, keeping my voice neutral, professional, like this was just another step in routine care, which means as far as this hospital is concerned, you do not exist. And I felt his eyes on me, sharper now, more focused, like that piece of information mattered more than anything else I could have said. And yet, he replied slowly, you decided to keep it that way. And there it was, the question he was not asking directly. Why? And I swallowed, not because I did not have an answer, but because I had too many. None of them logical, none of them safe. Because they were not here for. Your health? I said finally, meeting his gaze again, steady this time. No hesitation left. And I do not help people who come looking like that. And something shifted in his expression again, subtle but real, like I had confirmed something he already suspected, and he leaned back slightly, just enough to ease the tension in his shoulders, but not enough to look relaxed, never relaxed. And I realized then that whatever world he came from, rest was not part of it. You are making a dangerous assumption, he said, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful, and I shook my head once, a small movement, but certain. No, I said, I am making a choice. And the words hung there between us, heavier than anything else we had said so far, because they were not about him anymore. They were about me, about the line I had crossed and the fact that I was not trying to step back over it. And for the first time since he opened his eyes, his gaze softened, not in weakness, not in gratitude, but in recognition, like he was seeing something unexpected in someone he had already categorized. And the silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less like tension and more like understanding, fragile and incomplete, but there. And then the overhead speaker crackled to life, announcing another incoming patient, another emergency, another reminder that the world outside this moment had not stopped just because mine had shifted. And I stepped back, creating space I was not sure I wanted. You need to stay here, I said, my voice returning to that firm, controlled tone I used when I needed people to listen without questioning. Do not speak unless I tell you to. Do not move unless I say it is safe. And his eyes followed me as I reached for supplies, as I adjusted the four, as I did everything I could to keep my hands busy and my thoughts from catching up to me. And when I finally glanced back, he was still watching, still silent, exactly as I had asked. And that should have reassured me. It should have made this easier, but instead it made something else settle in my chest, something heavier, something I could not ignore anymore, because trust, real trust, was not something you gave to a stranger in a room like this, not without a reason, and I had no idea yet what his was, or why I felt like I had just become part of it. The next 15 minutes moved too fast and not fast enough at the same time, like the entire emergency room had decided to speed up while I was stuck in a single moment that refused to let me breathe properly. And I kept telling myself to focus on what I could control, the monitors, the chart, the rhythm of my own hands as I adjusted his four-line and checked his vitals again, steady, controlled, stronger than they should have been for someone broad in the way he was. And that alone told me, more than any file ever could, he was not just surviving, he was enduring. And there was a difference, one that made people like him far more dangerous than anyone walking through those doors. And I should have stepped back then, should have handed him off to another nurse, pretended none of this had anything to do with me. But every time I tried to take that step, something stopped me, something quiet and stubborn that refused to let go. You keep watching the door, he said suddenly, his voice low but clear enough to cut through the noise around us. And I did not look at him right away because that would mean admitting he was right. But my shoulders tightened anyway, a reaction I could not hide fast enough. That is because they might come back, I answered, keeping my tone even, controlled, like this was just another calculation, not the truth sitting heavy in my chest. and he shifted slightly on the gurney. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to test his own limits. And I stepped closer immediately, lowering my voice. "Do not move," I said, sharper than before, because the last thing we needed was someone noticing him before I was ready. And his gaze flicked to mine, not annoyed, not defiant, just assessing, always assessing, like every reaction I gave him was another piece of information he was storing away. "You are not afraid of me," he said, not as a question, not even as an observation, more like a conclusion he had already reached, and that stopped me for a second, just long enough for the truth to surface before I could push it back down. Because he was right. I was not afraid of him, not in the way I should have been, not in the way anyone else in that room probably would have been if they knew who he was. And I exhaled slowly, steadying myself before I answered. "I am afraid of what happens if I make the wrong move," I said, meeting his eyes again, holding that connection even though it felt like standing too close to something I did not fully understand. And for the first time, something in his expression shifted in a way that was almost human, less controlled, less distant, like I had said something that reached past whatever walls he kept in place. And the silence that followed felt heavier than before, not tense, but charged, like something had just changed between us without either of us naming it. And then the doors opened again, not the same men this time, but hospital security moving through the hallway with more purpose than usual, and my pulse jumped immediately because patterns mattered, timing mattered, and nothing about tonight had been random so far. "Stay here," I said quietly, my voice dropping just enough that only he could hear, and I stepped away before he could respond, moving toward the nurse's station with a calm I did not feel, because panic would ruin everything. And I leaned over the counter, scanning the board, pretending to check assignments while I listened, really listened, to the conversations happening around me, fragments of information slipping through the noise. Someone reported suspicious activity. One of the guards said to the charge nurse, his tone low but urgent, and my stomach tightened because that was exactly the kind of attention we could not afford. Not now. Not with him still here and still unregistered. And I forced myself to turn slowly, casually, like I had nothing to hide, like this was just another shift, another night, another patient. But when I glanced back toward Bay 3, he was already watching me, his eyes locked on mine across the room, steady, unshaken, like he had already understood what I was about to realize, that whatever space I had created for him was shrinking, and that staying silent was no longer going to be enough to keep him hidden. The word suspicious did not leave my head once I heard it. It stayed there, looping, sharpening everything around me until every movement felt louder, every voice felt closer, and I forced myself to breathe slower as I stepped back from the nurse's station, because panic would not help him, and it would definitely expose me. And when I returned to Bay 3, he had not moved, not even an inch. But there was something different in the way he was watching me now, not just observant, but ready, like he had already adjusted to whatever was coming next. "They are tightening the search," I said quietly as I reached for the monitor again, keeping my hands busy because stillness made everything worse. "Security is asking questions," and his gaze did not break from mine, not even for a second. "Then you should step away," he replied, calm, almost detached, like this was not his problem to solve, like he had already accepted the outcome and removed himself from it. And that irritated me more than it should have, because I had crossed too many lines already to pretend this was not mine anymore. "If I step away now, you will not make it out of this room," I said, my voice lower, sharper, the truth cutting through whatever distance he was trying to create. And for a moment, something flashed in his eyes, not anger, not surprise, something closer to respect, like I had said exactly what he needed to hear, even if he did not want to admit it. And the overhead lights flickered once, just briefly, but enough to pull my attention upward before snapping back to him. And that was when the idea formed. Fast and incomplete, but clear enough to act on, because waiting was no longer an option. "Can you stand?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, and his brow tightened slightly, not from confusion but from calculation, like he was weighing the risk before answering. "For how long?" he said, and I exhaled slowly, steadying my thoughts into something usable. "Long enough to not be here when they come back," I replied, and the silence that followed stretched just long enough for me to realize what I was suggesting. Not just hiding him anymore, but moving him, taking him out of the one place I could Control into a space I could not predict, and that should have stopped me. It should have made me step back and let someone else take over, but it did not, because the alternative was leaving him exactly where they expected to find him, and I was not going to let that happen, not after everything that had already been set in motion. And he pushed himself up slowly, controlled, precise, like even now he refused to show weakness. And I stepped in immediately, adjusting the blanket, shifting his position just enough to make it look routine if anyone glanced our way. "Lean on me if you have to," I said quietly, not looking at him as I reached for a spare jacket hanging near the supply cart. One of the oversized ones we kept for patients being discharged late at night, and I draped it over his shoulders, covering what I could, minimizing what I could not, and when my fingers brushed his arm, just briefly, I felt it. That tension, not from pain but from restraint, like he was holding himself together through sheer will. And for a second, I wondered how many times he had done this before, how many situations he had walked out of simply because he refused to fall, and the thought made something tighten in my chest, something I pushed aside immediately because I did not have time to understand it. "We go through the back corridor," I said, my voice steady now, more certain than I felt. "Less cameras, less traffic." And he nodded once, just once. No hesitation, no questions, just trust. And that hit me harder than anything else had so far, because trust like that was not given lightly, not by someone like him, not in a place like this. And as we moved, slow but deliberate, blending into the rhythm of the hospital instead of fighting against it, I realized something I had not allowed myself to think until now. That this was no longer just about getting him out. This was about what happened after, about the fact that once he walked through those doors, once he disappeared into whatever world he came from, nothing about this night would stay behind, not for him, and definitely not for me. The hallway behind the emergency room felt colder than it should have, like the air did not belong to the same building anymore. And every step we took echoed just a little too clearly against the tile floor, forcing me to slow down, to match the rhythm of someone who had every right to be there, because rushing would draw attention, and attention was the one thing we could not afford. And I kept my hand lightly on his arm, not enough to guide him, not enough to suggest weakness, just enough to make it look like routine support, like a nurse helping a patient who had stayed a little too long. And he moved with me, steady, controlled, his pace matching mine without hesitation, without question, like he had already accepted that for this moment I was the one leading. And that realization settled somewhere deeper than I expected, because men like him did not follow, not easily, not without reason. And the thought made me more aware of everything. The flicker of overhead lights, the distant hum of machines, the faint voices echoing from rooms we passed without stopping, each one a reminder that we were still inside a system built on rules I was actively breaking. "Left," I murmured under my breath as we reached the intersection near the supply corridor, not turning my head, not drawing attention, just letting the word exist between us, and he adjusted immediately. No delay, no hesitation. And I felt it again, that quiet alignment, like we had fallen into something neither of us had planned, but both of us understood. And as we moved deeper into the back corridors, the noise faded, replaced by a kind of silence that made every sound sharper, more defined. And my pulse started to pick up again, not from fear exactly, but from the awareness that we were leaving the part of the hospital I knew how to control, stepping into spaces where routine did not protect me anymore. And I tightened my grip just slightly, grounding myself in something real. "There is a service exit about 50 feet ahead," I said quietly, my voice steady even though my thoughts were racing ahead of me, mapping possibilities, calculating risks, trying to stay one step in front of something I could not see. And he nodded once, his gaze shifting briefly down the hallway before returning to me, always returning to me, like I was the anchor point in a situation that should have belonged entirely to him. And that thought made something shift inside my chest again, something I did not have time to understand, because the sound of footsteps reached us before we saw anyone, distant at first, then closer, echoing in a way that told me exactly how little space we had left to adjust. And I stopped, just for a fraction of a second, my mind racing through options, none of them good, all of them risky. And then I turned slightly, positioning myself between him and the direction of the sound, not dramatic, not obvious, just enough to block the line of sight if someone turned the corner too quickly. Maintenance check, I said under my breath, more to myself than to him. Already reaching for the supply cart parked against the wall, pulling it forward just enough to create a barrier that looked accidental instead of intentional. And I grabbed a clipboard from the top, flipping it open without looking at the pages, because details mattered, even the ones no one questioned. And when the two staff members rounded the corner, their conversation trailing off as they noticed us, I did not hesitate. I did not pause. I just moved, stepping into their line of sight with the same controlled irritation I used when shifts ran too long and people asked too many questions. Supply issue in the back room, I said before they could speak, my tone clipped, efficient, giving them a reason not to ask anything else, and they nodded, distracted, already moving past us, because confidence closed doors faster than explanations ever could, and I waited until their footsteps faded before I exhaled slowly, the tension in my shoulders easing just enough to remind me how tight it had been. And when I turned back to him, he was already watching me again, that same steady, unreadable gaze. But there was something new in it now, something quieter, something that felt less like observation and more like understanding. And for a second, just a second, I let myself meet that look fully, without deflecting, without stepping away, and I realized that somewhere between the emergency room and this narrow hallway, this had stopped being just a decision I made under pressure. It had become something else entirely, something that was no longer about rules or consequences, but about the fact that I had chosen him, and he had chosen to trust me. And there was no version of this night where that did not change everything. The service exit door was closer now. I could see the faint red glow of the exit sign reflecting off the metal frame, only a few yards ahead, and for a moment I let myself believe we might actually make it out without anything else going wrong. But that was the mistake, thinking the hardest part was already behind us, because just as we stepped into the final stretch of hallway, the sharp crackle of a radio broke the silence, followed by a voice that was too clear, too close. Check the rear corridors. And my entire body went still for half a second before instinct forced me forward again. Faster now, but not rushing, never rushing, because speed drew eyes and we could not afford that. Not here, not now. And I felt him adjust beside me, matching the shift without needing to be told, his presence steady, controlled, like he was already preparing for something I had not fully processed yet. They are closing in, I whispered, my voice tight despite my effort to keep it level, and he did not answer right away, his gaze flicking briefly toward the door ahead, then back to me, measuring, calculating, always one step ahead of the moment. Then we changed direction, he said quietly, and that stopped me, not because it was wrong, but because it meant letting go of the plan I had been holding on to since we left the emergency room, the one path I believed I could control. And I shook my head once, sharper than I intended. No, I said under my breath. If we turn now, we walk right into them. And the tension between us shifted, not conflict, not exactly, but something close to it, like two people used to leading suddenly standing on the same ground, forced to decide who moved first. And for a second, just a second, I saw it in his eyes, that instinct to take over, to push past me and handle this his way, the way he was used to, the way that probably worked every other time in his world. But this was not his world, not here, not inside these walls where routine and perception mattered more than power. And I stepped closer, closing that space before he could move, my voice lower now, firmer. You trusted me this far, I said, holding his gaze so he could not look away. Trust me for 30 more seconds. And the words hung there, between us, heavy with everything neither of us was saying. And then he nodded once, slow, deliberate, and something in my chest eased just enough to let me think clearly again, because now it was on me, fully, no hesitation left, no second guessing, just action. And I reached for the handle of the supply closet door just before the exit, pulling it open without breaking stride and guiding him inside, quick but controlled, closing it just enough to leave a narrow gap, not locked, not obvious, just another door in a hallway full of them. And the space was tight, shelves lined with boxes and equipment, the air warmer, still, and for a second the world outside felt distant, muted by the thin barrier between us and everything waiting on the other side. And I stepped back just enough to look at him, really look this time, not as a patient, not as a problem to solve, but as the man I had chosen to protect without knowing why. And the closeness made everything sharper. The tension, the silence, the awareness of how quickly this could all fall apart. "We wait," I said quietly, my voice softer now, but no less certain. "They sweep past. We follow behind." And his eyes stayed on mine, steady, unreadable. But there was something else there now, something I could not ignore even if I tried, because it felt like more than trust, more than calculation, something deeper that neither of us had named yet. And the sound of footsteps passed outside, closer now, voices low but urgent, moving past the door without stopping, and I held my breath without realizing it, counting the seconds in my head, 1, 2, 3, until the noise began to fade, until the pressure in the air shifted just enough to tell me the moment was passing, and I reached for the door again, my fingers steady despite everything. And just before I pushed it open, he spoke, his voice low, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it. "When this is over," he said, and I paused, just for a second, because I already knew that whatever he was about to say would not leave this hallway unchanged, and neither would I. His voice did not rise, did not rush. It settled into the space between us like something inevitable, like a statement that had already been decided long before this moment. And I felt it before I fully understood it. The shift, the weight of what he was about to say pressing against everything I had been trying to keep separate. "When this is over," he repeated, quieter this time, and I realized I had not moved. My hand still resting against the edge of the door, my breath caught somewhere between staying and leaving. And for a second I considered stopping him, cutting it off before it became something I could not ignore, but I did not, because part of me needed to hear it, needed to understand what this meant to him, what I had become in a situation that should have been temporary. "You do not walk away from this," he said, his gaze locked on mine, steady, certain, like there was no version of the future where I simply returned to my life unchanged, and something in my chest tightened at that. Not fear, not exactly, but the recognition that he was right, that there was no clean ending to something that had already crossed so many lines, and I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay grounded, to not let his words pull me into a place I was not ready to stand in. "That is not your decision to make," I replied, my voice softer than before, but no less firm, because if I gave that up, even a little, I would lose more than just control of the moment. And his expression did not harden, did not challenge me the way I expected. Instead it shifted, subtle but real, like he was adjusting to something he had not anticipated, something he could not simply take or command. And the silence that followed felt different now, less like tension and more like a line being drawn, one that neither of us fully understood yet. And I pushed the door open just enough to look into the hallway again, the light sharper after the dim space, the air cooler as it slipped through the narrow gap, and the corridor was empty now, the voices gone, the movement shifted somewhere else. And this was the moment, the one we had been waiting for, the one that would either carry us out or pull everything back down on top of us. "Now," I whispered, stepping out first, not waiting to see if he followed because I already knew he would. And we moved again, faster this time, but still controlled, blending into the quiet rhythm of a hallway that no longer felt neutral, every step bringing us closer to the exit sign that seemed brighter now, more real, like something we could actually reach. And when we finally pushed through the service door, the air outside hit differently, colder, sharper, carrying the distant hum of the city that had nothing to do with what we had just left behind. And for a moment I just stood there, letting that shift settle, the realization that we had made it past the part one could control, and into something else entirely, something that no longer followed the rules I understood. And he stepped beside me, close enough that I could feel the presence without needing to look. And when I did turn, his gaze was already on me, steady, unreadable, but no longer distant. Not the way it had been when this started, and the space between us felt smaller now, not because of where we stood, but because of everything that had happened to bring us here. "You said 30 seconds, he said quietly, and there was something in his tone that was almost unfamiliar, something lighter, not quite humor, not quite anything I could name. And I let out a breath that almost felt like a laugh, even though nothing about this night had been simple. "You are still here," I replied, and the words carried more meaning than I intended, because staying had never been part of the plan, not for him, not for me. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything we had not said, everything we had avoided, everything that was waiting just beneath the surface. And for the first time since this began, I realized something that should have been obvious from the start, that getting him out of that hospital was never going to be the end of this. It was only the beginning, and whatever came next was not something I could walk away from, no matter how much I told myself I could. The cold air outside should have felt like relief, like the end of something tense and fragile, but it did not. It only made everything sharper, clearer, like stepping out of a controlled environment and realizing how exposed the world really was. And I wrapped my arms tighter around myself without thinking, not from the temperature, but from the shift, from the way the silence between us had changed into something heavier, something that could not be ignored anymore. And I took a step back. Just one, enough to create space that had not existed a moment ago, because distance felt necessary now, even if it was already too late for it to mean anything. You should go, I said, my voice quieter than I intended, not as firm as it had been inside, because the rules I had relied on no longer applied out here. And for the first time since I met him, I felt something close to uncertainty, not about what I had done, but about what came next. And he did not move right away, did not turn, did not step into the shadows like I expected. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, his gaze fixed on me with that same steady intensity that had followed me from the emergency room to this moment. And it made my pulse pick up again, slower this time but deeper, like something inside me was responding before I could stop it. You are telling me to leave, he said, not questioning, not challenging, just repeating it like he was testing the weight of the words, and I nodded once, forcing myself to hold that line. This is where it ends, I replied, even though something in my chest resisted the finality of it, because endings were supposed to feel clean, simple, and this did not even close, and the corner of his mouth shifted slightly, not quite a smile, not quite disbelief, something in between. That is not how this works, he said quietly. And there it was again, that certainty, that assumption that the world followed rules he understood, and I shook my head, sharper this time, grounding myself in something I could still control. That is exactly how this works, I said, meeting his gaze without hesitation. You needed help. I gave it, and now you walk away. And the words felt right when I said them, logical, necessary, but they did not land the way I expected, not on him, and not on me, because the silence that followed was not agreement. It was something else, something unresolved, and he took a step closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough to close the distance I had just created, and my breath caught for a second before I forced it steady again, refusing to step back, refusing to give him that ground. You made a choice tonight, he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, like every word mattered in a way it had not before. Not because you had to, but because you decided to, and I felt that, the truth of it settling deeper than I wanted, because he was right. No one had forced me. No one had asked me. I had chosen every step of this, and there was no pretending otherwise. And you think that means something, I replied, trying to keep my voice even, trying to push back against the weight of what he was implying. But it did not come out as strong as I intended, and his gaze did not waver, not even slightly. It means everything, he said, and the certainty in his voice made something inside me shift, something I could not ignore anymore, because this was not just about him leaving. This was about the fact that I had stepped into his world without understanding what that meant. And there was no version of this where I could pretend I had not. And the city noise carried faintly in the distance, cars passing, voices echoing somewhere beyond the hospital walls, a reminder that life was continuing like nothing had changed, even though everything had. And I exhaled slowly, the tension in my shoulders settling into something quieter, heavier. I do not belong in your world, I said finally, the words coming out softer than anything I had said all night, but more honest than all of it combined. And for a moment, just a moment, something in his expression shifted in a way I had not seen before, something almost human, almost understanding, and he nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he accepted the truth of that even if he did not agree with it. No, he said, his voice steady but quieter now, but now it knows you. And the words settled between us like a promise I had never agreed to make, like a line that had already been crossed long before I realized it existed. And he stepped back then, finally creating distance on his own terms. And for a second I thought that was it, that he would turn and disappear into whatever life waited for him beyond this moment. But before he did, his gaze found mine one last time, holding it just long enough to make sure I understood, and then he was gone, moving into the night with the same controlled presence he had carried through everything, leaving me standing there with nothing but the echo of his words and the quiet realization that no matter how much I wanted to believe this was over, it never really would be, because some choices do not end when the moment passes. They follow you, reshape you, and wait for the day they come back to collect what they were always owed.